Section 5 of Dr. Deane's Way and Other Stories by Fay Huntington and Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. How It Happened by Pansy, Chapter 1. Baby Nell. Baby Nell has 10 little toes. Baby Nell has 2 little hose. She always stares when the hose go on, and thinks that her 10 little toes are gone. There she sat, the very baby Nell of whom that immortal poet wrote those lines. At least she looked as though she might be the selfsame baby, as she watched with those astonished blue eyes of hers, while Sister Elsie poked and squeezed the fat pink toes into the bits of stockings. Sister Elsie, meanwhile, lecturing her after this fashion. "What a naughty, naughty baby you are to pull off your stockings so many times a day. Keep poor Elsie racing after them and putting them on from morning till night. What do you do it for? Don't you know you're a troublesome, mischievous, perfect little torment of a precious old darling?" And having finished this singular scolding, and squeezed one foot into place, Elsie stopped to smother the baby face in a perfect torrent of kisses. Then she went on with her work, Nell staring the while, and occasionally making a remark in German, which, as nearly as I can judge, she spoke fluently. "Elsie!" called a clear, ringing voice from the room above. And Elsie answered, "Yes, mamma, I'm coming. I'm putting on baby Nell's stockings. Keep your foot still, baby. Don't curl your little toe up so. How can I ever put a stocking on such a funny little ball of a foot? Oh dear, let go of my hat. You'll have it off. Oh, my patience! Don't pull my hair." All of which orders baby Nell minded as much as young misses of her age generally do. After gazing a while at things in general, she suddenly bent forward and dived both fat hands into the masses of yellow curls that were bobbing about her face. And Elsie, in despair, dropped the pink-toed foot, unbent every one of the 10 determined fingers, and saying, "Go barefoot then, naughty darling," ran hastily to obey her mother's second call. Baby looked after her thoughtfully, then reached over and felt of every one of her dainty bare toes, then gravely tugged at the other stocking, uttered a triumphant "da da da ah" at her success, when it came off with such a jerk that it nearly tipped her over, and looking about her for something to do next. It was house cleaning time, and mamma and everybody else was very busy, which explained why baby Nell was left alone for even so few minutes. Generally they knew better than to leave the little mischief maker out of sight of watchful eyes. She spied a crumpled bit of white paper over by the window, and went for it as fast as hands and knees could take her, gave several eager little chuckles over the crackling sound, then crept to the stovepipe hole and solemnly dropped it down. Then she sat up straight and gave a satisfied little sigh. That work was successfully accomplished. Mamma and Elsie came in together, Elsie talking rapidly. "Oh, mamma, do look at baby Nell. I do believe I've put her stockings on 20 times today, and here she is barefoot, and she curls her foot up just like a little ball of cotton when I go to put them on. Where in the world is the paper that this was wrapped in? Mamma, what do you suppose has become of it? I unrolled it the minute I came in the room, because baby snatched at it, and her fingers were wet with milk, and I was afraid it would soak through and spoil the ribbon. Now, where do you think it can be?" "I don't know, dear. Take some other paper and make haste, for Miss Johnson is waiting. And Elsie, you must stop at the store and tell your father to send up some fresh biscuit for tea." "Mamma, there isn't a paper here to tear. There never is when I'm in a hurry. May I tear a piece from this one, just this once? It is a week old, and I heard papa say it was awful dry." Mrs. Porter was stamping her foot softly and saying, "No, no, don't touch, baby mustn't." Then she said, despairingly, "Oh, dear me, when will that baby learn that the stove will burn her?" Then to her other daughter, "Yes, yes, child, take a piece of anything, only hurry." Mrs. Porter was not a cross woman, but you see she had been cleaning house. The paper was torn and the ribbon rolled up, and Elsie on the street was joined by her very particular friend, Carrie Cox. The two went gleefully on together, glad that their errands lay in the same direction. Down Ferry Street, up Franklin, they came at last to the milliner's shop, and Elsie unrolled her ribbon and laid it on the counter, giving her message all in one breath, as she was apt to do. "Mrs. Smith, mamma says this ribbon is too light, I mean. She must have it 2 shades darker. She wants it to match baby Nell's eyes. And if you haven't it, will you please send for some, and she'll wait to finish the sack." No ribbon the color of baby Nell's eyes was to be found, which was no wonder, for if you had but seen those eyes, you would have thought that nothing short of a piece of the sky could have matched them. Out went the bustling girls, Elsie talking as usual. "Now, Carrie, what is your errand? If it is more than a minute long, I can't go with you, for I've got to hurry. Mamma wants to know about the ribbon, because, if Miss Johnson can't finish baby Nell's sack tonight, she wants to go out and match the merino for her dress before dark." "I'm to call at Miss Draper's for her sleeve pattern. That won't take half a minute." "Miss Draper's? Let's go down Vesey Street then." "No, let's go down Stone Street. That's the quickest." So they stopped at the corner, and one pulled one way and one the other. The wind decided it at last, Elsie said, for it blew them around the corner of Stone Street. "Now I'll have to stop in papa's store," she said. "I've got an errand." "So have I, only let's go to Miss Draper's first, because I've got to carry my errand home from your papa's store, and it will be heavy, and Miss Draper's is only around the corner." "It will be longer," said Elsie thoughtfully. "Oh, no, it won't either. Why, Carrie, I've got an errand away up North Street. Stone Street was right after all. See here, Carrie, I'm taking this piece of paper with me. It was what the ribbon was rolled in. How came I to bring it away with me, I wonder? I'll give it to the wind now." "Oh, you awful girl!" Carrie said, catching a glimpse of it as it whizzed away. "Mamma never allows me to tear a religious paper." "We don't tear 'em either, and I suppose that's the reason they're always on top of the heap when I go to look for one to tear. But today they were all religious papers, and mamma was in a hurry, and she said, 'Take anything.' There's nothing on this one, anyway." Away went the paper, whistling round and round, then straight ahead, then taking a zigzag course, as if it made no difference where it went. There was a bakery on Stone Street. There was a smell of fresh, warm bread, and whiffs of hot rolls stealing out on the air, as the great glass doors constantly opened and shut. There stood a boy outside, looking in, with oh, such a longing face! A ragged, forlorn, hopeless-looking boy. His hat was torn, his jacket was torn, and the dirty sleeve of his shirt was torn and hung in strings. But they were as nothing compared with the hungry look in the boy's eyes. A man opened the bakery door and came out, basket in hand. Then suddenly he set the basket on a standard outside and hurried in again. Up came the wind and seized the paper that had been tucked around the fresh rolls and whirled it away into the air. Then the ragged boy turned his hungry eyes on the rolls. What if he should take one, two? Nobody was looking, and he was so hungry. The man would not miss two, no, one. He wouldn't take but one. Like enough the man would give him that, if he knew how hungry he was. He must have just one. End of section 5. Section 6 of Dr. Deane's Way and Other Stories by Faye Huntington and Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. How It Happened, Chapter 2. Rolls and Buns and Chances. My friend Bobby, to whom I told this story the other day, when I reached this point, said, "Ho, what a mean scamp he must have been to want to steal just because he saw buns! Why, I pass a great splendid bakery every morning, and there's lots and lots of magnificent things in the window, and I never think of such a thing." And his wiser sister Nellie said, "Yes, and you eat 17 buckwheat cakes before you start." We will hope, for the sake of Bobby's stomach, that Nellie meant 7 instead of 17, but the moral is the same. Bobby, with a full stomach, not only was not tempted to take buns, but had no sympathy for the hungry boy at the door. Well, whiz came the wind around the corner, and blew into that boy's very eyes a piece of paper, Elsie's piece, with nothing on it. He seized it. There were large letters on one side, great printing letters. He could hardly have helped reading them. "Thou, God, seest me." Now, this ragged boy remembered the time when he was about 5 years old, remembered that he had a beautiful blue and black plaid jacket, and that he stood at his mother's knee and spelled slowly out of a great book, pointing out with his fat fingers to every letter, THOUGHGODSEESTME. He knew what it meant then. His mother told him. If you want to know how a boy who once had a good mother, and a nice jacket, and fat fingers, came to be the ragged, homeless, hungry creature that he was that day, it is very quickly told. It was all because his father bought liquor of a good respectable man who kept a few barrels of it in the back room of his store, and the father drank and drank, a few drops more every day, until at last the respectable man wouldn't sell him any more, and then he went to a cellar grocery and drank rum. And there by that bakery window stood his homeless, friendless boy. He crumpled that bit of paper in his hand and stuffed it into his ragged pocket, while he muttered, "It's queer I should have forgot that." Then he went after the other paper. It was tired of its frolic, and lay still on the edge of a stone step. He picked it up, brushed off a bit of dust, discovered that the other side was still fair and clean, then he came and resolutely tucked up the rolls with a firm hand. "There's a lad who, if I mistake not, has fought a battle and come off victor," said a man who was looking out of one of the great windows, standing so that he could not be seen from the outside, and yet could see all that was passing. "Porter, I'm going to ask him in to get warm." "What is it? Some wretched nuisance of a boy? I wish they were all in Oregon." "Poh, no you don't. You're at your wits' ends for one this very minute. Come in, my lad, and warm your fingers. What's your name, my boy?" he asked, as the boy promptly accepted the invitation. "Stephen Turner, sir." "You're not very warmly clad for such weather. Where do you live?" "Jones's Alley, round the corner from the brewery." "Your father live there?" "No, sir, he's dead." "Have you a mother?" "No, sir, mother died 6 years ago." "With whom do you live then?" "Nobody but myself. There's an old woman lets me sleep in her basement. I pay her for it." "What employment have you?" "None at all, except odds and ends, and not many of them." "How do you live then?" "By my wits, mostly," the boy said, gravely, warming his blue fingers by the fire. "Don't you want to work?" At this question Stephen Turner looked up with a kind of grave surprise at the gentleman's face, but he only answered, "Yes, sir, of course." "Porter, why don't you give this boy some work?" the gentleman asked, turning quickly towards the busy man behind the counter. "Looks like it," said Mr. Porter briefly. As for Stephen, he looked neither surprised nor disappointed. "That's what they all say," he exclaimed. "I never earned enough to buy my clothes." The people kept coming and going, and pretty soon came Elsie and Carrie. They eyed the ragged boy curiously, at least Carrie did. As for Elsie, she was talking. "Papa, Mamma wants you to send fresh biscuit for supper. And oh, Papa, Mrs. Carter was in Dr. Phillips. Mamma sent me to Dr. Phillips, and Mrs. Carter said it was very fortunate for her that I came in, and she wants her rolls an hour earlier than usual, because Mr. Carter is to take the 7 o'clock train. He's going to New York. And Papa, he's going to bring little Katie a music box, and she wants them fresh and hot." "She's a nuisance," sputtered peppery Mr. Porter. "You go back and tell her she can't have them at all. Tell her both my boys are sick. Boys are always having measles or mumps." "I've had 'em both," interrupted Stephen, gravely. "There," said the gentleman. "What better recommendation do you need? Try the boy, Porter." "Stuff and nonsense! Do you know where Mrs. John Carter lives?" "Yes, sir." "How many rolls will you eat if I send you up there with hers?" Stephen was very grave and simple in his answer. "Not one, sir." "I doubt it," Mr. Porter said quickly, "but I've got to try it." An hour after that, Elsie Porter was putting on baby Nell's stockings when she looked up quickly and said, "Mamma, here comes Papa's new boy that I told you about. He's got a note for you, I guess." "What a looking boy!" said Mrs. Porter, and then Rosie led him into the room, and Mrs. Porter read her note. "Dear Alice, find some clothes, can't you, for this rag bag? And give him some supper. I've hired him for a week on trial. He went to Carter's and back quicker than any boy I ever had, if he went there at all, which I rather doubt. Yours hastily, Husband." Mrs. Porter went to look up clothes, and presently Elsie sat baby Nell on the floor and ran after her. Stephen looked at the small, sweet face and nodded and smiled. Baby Nell smiled back. Stephen nodded harder and whistled a little, and baby Nell laughed outright. "Is Rosie in the dining room?" Mrs. Porter asked of her daughter. "No, ma'am." "Then run right back. We don't know anything about this dreadful-looking boy. Perhaps he may be tempted to steal something." Elsie ran back, but she was not quick enough. Stephen had stolen something, and he went away with it too. It was baby Nell's heart. Baby Nell shed some tears because the boy went away, but was consoled by a red-cheeked apple, and as she tried with her 2 pearly teeth to bite a hole in the smooth skin, she forgot all about Stephen Turner. In fact, she had not the least idea that she had anything to do with his life, nor once imagined that because she just happened to drop a piece of crackly paper down the stovepipe hole, therefore Stephen Turner had a good supper and a new jacket, and had been hired on trial for a week. And baby Nell was not a bit less wise than her elders. "Mamma, isn't he a funny-looking boy?" Elsie said, as she watched him from the window. "I'm glad Papa hired him. He looked so sad. Isn't it queer that he happened into the store just as I came to tell Papa that Mrs. Carter wanted her rolls earlier?" Stephen Turner, as he walked back to the bakery, in his new gray jacket, and with the taste of the cold corned beef still in his mouth, said to himself, "I got my supper, good supper too, and I didn't take the man's rolls. I'm glad of that. It's odd how that bit of paper happened to come flying into my face just then." "That chap happened in at just the right time," Mr. Porter said, eating his supper in haste, and telling wife and daughter about the day's troubles between the mouthfuls. So they all talked about the things that happened, and not one of them seemed to think about that great Father of them all, who planned all the happiness that there is in the world. End of section 6. Section 7 of Dr. Deane's Way and Other Stories by Fay Huntington and Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. How It Happened, Chapter 3. He was the boy that Mr. Porter engaged for a week trial, you know. You remember him? Well, at the end of a week, Mr. Porter said, "I guess you and I will try it together for a month, my boy." "He isn't brisk," Mr. Porter explained to his wife when she asked about Stephen. "You'd call him slow and dull, and think he wasn't going to amount to much. But somehow, when he gets started, he keeps started. Stays in motion, you know, until the thing is all done up. When I see him shoulder his basket and start for Murray's up on the hill, I'm just as sure of his going steadily there as I am that he has started. You remember that spry little Jimmy Norton that I had? Well, Jimmy would be up the street and around the corner while this boy is getting ready to open the door, but half an hour after you'd find Jimmy no further than just around the corner, watching a dog fight or rolling marbles maybe, while Stephen would be trudging down the hill with his empty basket. So you see, what he lacks in briskness he makes up in stick-to-itiveness. I've had a good many boys to deal with, and I always noticed that those who stick at their work in spite of dogs or marbles or horses come out at the top of the heap after all. At the end of the month there was nothing said about another contract. I think Mr. Porter forgot it, but Stephen did not, and his heart was in his mouth until just as he was leaving, feeling very sad and discouraged, Mr. Porter said, "I shall want you half an hour earlier than usual tomorrow morning. Will you be on hand?" "Yes, sir," said Stephen, with unusual briskness, and vanished. At home, or at the place he called home, the cellar where he paid for the privilege of sleeping, by the window stood a little girl flattening her nose against the pane, a dirty, ragged, forlorn girl who had yellow hair and never combed it. Her eyes were gray, and her skin was freckled. Her nose didn't need flattening, it was short and broad enough already. She did not turn from the one dingy window when Stephen came in, but spoke quickly. "Well, are you discharged?" "No." "Hired over?" "Why, I don't know," said Stephen, slowly and thoughtfully. "Yes, I think I am." "Humph!" the little girl said, in rather a scornful tone. "It's queer you can't tell for certain. I could decide which it was awful quick." Then they were silent while Stephen ate his supper. I suppose you think there was a table spread with a white cloth and clean dishes on it, and bread and butter, and cake, of course. Nobody has supper without cake, only maybe it wasn't in a cake basket, since they were so poor, but on a common plate. Let me just tell you about it. There were just 3 plates belonging to that family, and they were in the cupboard this minute, and held, 1 a loaf of bread, 1 a very little lump of butter, and 1 4 cold potatoes. These things were for the little girl and her grandmother's breakfast and dinner next day. Stephen boarded himself. He went into the corner at the foot of the bed, took a biscuit out of one pocket and a dried herring out of the other, and with these he made a hearty meal. When there was just the tail of the herring left, he spoke suddenly. "Dick, have you had a herring lately?" Then you would probably have looked around for a stout boy named Dick to answer this question. But the little girl at the window answered, "Not in ages." Then Stephen eyed the herring's tail. He wanted it awfully. But at last he said, "Come over here and get this bite." And Dick answered him as promptly as before, "I shan't. Eat it yourself." "No," he said firmly, gathering strength for his great self-denial. "No, I want you to have it. Here." And he came over with the dainty morsel and held it temptingly before her eyes. "There's just 1 bite left, and you shall have it. When Mr. Porter pays me, I mean to buy 3 of them and treat all around." Dick swallowed the tail without more ado, and when it was gone, said, "Why don't he pay you? He must be mean." "No," said Stephen, thoughtfully. "It isn't because he's mean, I don't think. Only he handles heaps of money every day, and mine is so little, you see, he forgets it." Dick turned back to the window and flattened her nose again. Pretty soon she said, with a long-drawn sigh, "I'd like to earn some money myself, Stephen." "Well," Stephen answered hopefully, "like as not you can. Who knows? I don't know. Chances come, you look and look for a way, and there isn't any, and you feel like fighting or stealing or something, and then all of a sudden comes a chance." "Chances have to be gone after." Dick said crossly. No, they don't, was Stephen's positive answer. They come. How did I get this place? I didn't go after it, nor know anything about it, and it come right along. I didn't do a thing. It just happened. You see, Stephen knew no more about the bit of tissue paper that baby Nell threw down the stovepipe hole, and Elsie's search for it, and the torn newspaper, how it came to flutter to him, and the man inside the bakery looking on, and the great God who overruleth it all, than he did before. Then I wish it would happen to me, that's all. This Dick said wearily, very much as if she didn't believe in any such thing. You might be getting ready for it. What do you mean? Why, you might wash your face, you know, and comb your hair. How would that get a chance to earn money? Besides, Stephen, you said you didn't do a thing. I s'pose I don't quite mean that. I walked along the street, you know, and look around, and if I had not been there by the bakery, you know, I would not have been called in, though how I came to be there at just that spot instead of any other, I don't know. But then, you see, there might come a chance to you that would take you if your hair was combed, and wouldn't if it wasn't. I haven't a comb, said Dick gravely. I might lend you mine, and Stephen drew forth a wooden comb that had seen much use. My hair would snap that all up in a twinkling, the young lady said, with a bit of scorn in her voice. You might comb it one little speck of a lock at a time, and then it would go all right. Well, Dick said after a little pause, I'll wash my face and comb my hair, and you walk along the streets and look around and see if any of your happens will come to me. Only don't begin until day after tomorrow, because I shan't get my hair combed before that time. I'll keep a lookout, was Stephen's grave answer. Something'll happen, you'll see if there don't. Then he went to the cupboard, set the bread and butter and potatoes on the highest shelf, and went to bed on the straw spread over the floor. Mrs. Porter was almost in despair. She was trying to set the table, for the cook was also the washerwoman, and it was Monday. Baby Nell was on hand. She had climbed a chair and tilted herself half out of an open window. Her mamma took her down with a scream of terror and closed the window. She had set one dainty slipper sailing in a 5-quart pan of milk. She had slipped into the pantry unawares, and stepped with one slippered and one bare foot into the box of sugar under the shelf, and, standing so, had reached up after a pan of flour, and showered it over her curly head. All this and much more in the space of one distracting hour. No wonder her mamma's cheeks burned like fire, and that the first thing she did when she sat down to the dinner table was to fan herself violently with her apron. End of section 7. Section 8 of Dr. Deane's Way and Other Stories by Fay Huntington and Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. How It Happened, Chapter 4. I am just completely tired out, and that's the whole of it, she said wearily. Such a forenoon as I have had. Baby Nell has done everything. And then followed a history of some of her pranks, at which father and daughter laughed, until they made the tired mother laugh too. Stephen Turner had come in with the mail, and he lingered and nodded and whistled softly, and clapped his hands at baby Nell, and finally took her in his arms to show her 2 cats sitting on the next neighbor's piazza in the sun. The mother breathed more freely. At least baby Nell was out of mischief for a few minutes. She was always good with Stephen. I wish he was a girl, Mrs. Porter said, looking with admiring eyes at the careful manner in which he held the fluttering morsel. Then I should keep him to take care of baby. She is very fond of him. Stephen looked eagerly interested. He didn't wish he was a girl, not he. He would much rather be a boy. But if this should happen to be the chance that he had been looking for? Mrs. Porter continued. I have made up my mind that I must have someone. Kate grows crosser every Monday because I have to hinder her so much, and I couldn't be hired to live through such another day as this. I had to keep Elsie at home until after 10 this morning. That won't do, Mr. Porter said promptly. Elsie ought to be in school. No, of course it won't do. But how am I going to help it? I can't find a girl. It certainly was the chance, and Stephen came forward with baby Nell in his arms. I know a girl who would like to come and take care of baby, he said earnestly. Who is she? Her name is Dick Bates. She is... But at this point Stephen stopped, abashed at Mrs. Porter's exclamation. Dick, I thought you said it was a girl. So she is, ma'am, and her name is Harriet Ann Bates, but folks have got in the notion of calling her Dick. Where does she live? She lives in the basement where I do. It's her grandma that lets me have the closet to sleep in. Is she the girl who had a pitcher the other day when you was at the pump, Stephen? Elsie asked this question, and Stephen nodded. Mamma, said Elsie, she's an awful-looking girl. Her dress was torn criss-cross every way, and so dirty and a fright, baby Nell would scream if she looked at her. Mrs. Porter looked as though she didn't mean to give her a chance to try it, and Stephen, somewhat downhearted, yet determined to do his best. She has combed her hair since then, he said eagerly. She got it all done this morning, and it looks real nice, and she mended her dress and washed her face, and she wants a chance real bad. Is she a good girl? Inquired Mr. Porter, and Stephen hesitated. Was Dick a good girl? She was sometimes rude and saucy to grandma, and slapped the children in the next room to theirs, and quarreled with the boys who lived in the attic. But then, grandma was cross, and the children needed slapping, and the boys teased her. Finally, he said, slowly and thoughtfully, She ain't very good, I s'pose, but I guess she means to be if she gets the chance, and she don't lie nor steal, and she would love baby Nell. What do you say, Alice? Asked Mr. Porter. Will you give the girl her chance? I'm sure I don't know, said poor puzzled, tired Mrs. Porter. How do I know but she'll be ugly to baby? To be sure, I could keep her with me and watch her, and I can't find anybody else as I see. But then, dear me, I don't want such a set around me. Oh, my patience! This last sentence was for baby Nell. She had slipped down from Stephen's arms, and pitched upon this particular time to climb a chair over in the corner, and from that to a table, and pull with all her little might at a pitcher that stood on it. Over it came at last, and the water splashed delightfully, and the pitcher made a grand crash as it bumped on the floor, and baby Nell gave a yell of glee over the success of her plans. When the hubbub was over, Mrs. Porter said, excitedly, That's the way it has been every minute this day, and is every day. The very second my back is turned, she finds somewhere to climb, and something to tip over. Stephen, said Mr. Porter, decidedly, you go home and get this girl, and then stay here till baby Nell gets a little acquainted with her. We'll try it anyhow. I don't suppose baby will have anything to do with her, Mrs. Porter said, doubtfully. You know if she takes a freak not to go to her, she won't, and you can't help yourself. Well, then, you can send her home, and you'll be no worse off than you were before you tried. Go ahead, Stephen. And Stephen went. I found the chance, he said, bursting into the basement, as Dick was eating her cold potato dinner. It happened along just where they always do, where you ain't thinking of finding them, and here it is. I don't see it, said Dick, coolly eyeing Stephen as she chewed the last mouthful of potato. And then Stephen told his story. She won't come to me, Dick said positively. "You see if she does. Babies never do." "She will if it's your chance," Stephen answered as positively, and Dick, whirling suddenly round to him, said, "Stephen, what do you mean when you say that?" "I don't exactly know," said Stephen, soberly. Some queer notion had got into his mind that there was a chance somewhere for everybody, if they only looked out for it and went to work at it. At least he thought it was a queer notion, but you and I know that it was the same idea that the good man had who said, "God has a plan for every man." End of section 8. Section 9 of Dr. Deane's Way and Other Stories by Fay Huntington and Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. How It Happened, Chapter 5. It was very much the same idea that you will find in your Bibles in the 10th chapter of Matthew and the 30th verse. But Stephen didn't know about that. Dick had managed to mend her green dress until it looked whole at least, and the business of combing her hair had been finished that morning, so although she did not look much like Elsie Porter, whom she met in her flesh buff pique dress and white ruffled apron, on her way to school, yet on the whole she looked better than Mrs. Porter expected, and after talking with her in the basement a few minutes, she took her upstairs to see if baby Nell would agree to the arrangement. Stephen had gone up to entertain the little lady while Mrs. Porter went down to receive Dick. Now, baby Nell was full of unaccountable freaks, one of which was to take violent dislikes to people, for nobody knew what reason, to scream with terror when they looked at her, and to go off into a succession of heart-rending shrieks if they attempted to touch her. The performance might be kept up for weeks, and whether she would choose to receive Dick in this fashion, no mortal knew. Stephen stood before the door holding the precious little tyrant in his arms, looking her sweetest and brightest. Dick slipped in after Mrs. Porter, and baby Nell looked at her. Dick's heart beat fast, not that she knew that this moment was to be the turning point in her whole life, not that she had the least notion of the power that lay in this roguish-looking baby to make her what she was not, but she wanted some work. Baby Nell didn't know it either. She hadn't the least idea that if she screeched like a little steam engine, Dick would be sent home in disgust and disappointment. Oh, none of them knew anything about the plan that God had for her, and for all of them through her. But they waited anxiously, and baby Nell stared. So far, good. At least she hadn't yelled. Dick nodded her head and smiled, and baby stared. Then Dick ventured on putting out her hands with a coaxing word. Baby turned halfway, half hid her head in Stephen's neck, then thought better of it and peeped out again. Still the coaxing hands were held out. Baby leaned forward a little, then drew back and hid her face, then peeped out, and suddenly, with a quick little squeal of glee, bounced herself fairly into Dick's outstretched arms. Once again, all unbeknown to her silly little self, baby Nell made a great change in another life as well as in her own. "It is a fortunate thing for me that she chanced to take a fancy to the girl," Mrs. Porter said, with a relieved sigh, as she watched Dick's careful handling of baby Nell. "For once in my life I'm in luck," Dick muttered to herself, as she squeezed baby's fat foot into her blue shoe. And Stephen, as he walked away from the door, said decidedly, "That's her chance for certain." They were packing and jamming themselves into the carriage. Mrs. Porter and Mrs. Willard and baby Nell filled the back seat, the Mrs. Willard took the middle seat, and Elsie was in front with the driver and Fred. "Dear me, mamma," said Elsie in dismay, "where will Dick put herself? We are all squeezed up now." "Dick can't go," Mrs. Porter declared emphatically. What with shawls and cloaks and lunch and people, we have just as much in here as we can stand." Dick stood on the walk below, looking with sorrowful, submissive face upon these preparations for the long talked of day to be spent on the beach. It was a white day to the Porter family. They had neither time nor money to spend very extensively in this way. One day by the ocean was the treat looked forward to by Elsie and Fred Porter, and talked of for weeks beforehand with eager delight. This year Dick had been counted in their plans, and had contrived to get up as much enthusiasm and more wonderment than themselves, for the sea was something that she had never seen in her life. "Oh, mamma," Elsie said, with a more dismayed face than before, "Dick must go. She has never seen the ocean, and baby Nell will be just as full of mischief as she can hold. We shall have to take care of her the whole day, and we shan't have a bit of a good time. Do please, mamma, let her go. Fred and I can squeeze closer." Mrs. Porter looked irresolute. "We certainly need her today, if we ever did," she said, thoughtfully, "but there really is no place for her." The driver looked down at the grave, wistful face of the child. He had a little girl at home who dearly loved the sea. "She might curl down here, ma'am, between my feet. She wouldn't take up much room," he said, addressing Mrs. Porter respectfully. "Very well," she answered in a listless tone, and so the matter was settled, and Dick promptly and gleefully curled herself into a very small space, and the carriage rolled away. End of section 9. Section 10 of Dr. Deane's Way and Other Stories by Fay Huntington and Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. How It Happened, Chapter 6. Only an hour's drive, then the great foaming ocean rolled and tumbled itself into view. They in the carriage gave it various greetings. Fred and Elsie screamed and clapped their hands in wild delight. The Misses Willard murmured, "How perfectly magnificent!" Mamma Willard said cheerily, "There it is, baby Nell, something you never saw before in your life." Dick looked at it in solemn silence, with great, gray, astonished eyes. As for Mrs. Porter, I am not sure that she even heard the roar of the waves. The truth is, she was thinking of something else. The carriage unpacked itself, and the inmates wandered off to indulge their various moods. Dick shouldered baby Nell, and stood still in the deep white sand, staring. The other children began a wild search after shells. The young ladies took to writing their names in the sand with the points of their parasols, and Mrs. Porter left the rest and moved away alone. Truth to tell, she was in a very uncomfortable state of mind. The ocean might be all very well for those who liked it, but she was in no mood to enjoy it that morning. It seemed to her that the white waves made much ado about nothing, seething and boiling and tumbling over each other in mad haste, apparently to reach somewhere, and then suddenly falling back to do the very same thing over again, hundreds and thousands of times. She turned her back upon it with an impatient frown, and continued her reverie. The subject was an important one. Her troubles were definite, but they could be expressed very briefly. She wanted a new parlor carpet, and fresh curtains, and Mr. Porter had that very morning represented to her the impossibility of his incurring that expense during the present year. His words had been very kind. He had assured her that nothing would give him greater pleasure than to gratify her if he could do so. Mrs. Porter was not given to foolish moods. Many and many were the things that she silently, patiently did without, but this had been a long cherished wish, and the disappointment had come upon her suddenly, and at a time when she was rasped with a dozen other trifles. So she turned her back upon old ocean, and looked contemptuously on her sister-in-law, Mrs. Willard, who had joined the children in their search after shells. Mrs. Willard," she said bitterly, "can afford to play. She has nothing else to do." Mrs. Willard owned a grand house on Pennsylvania Avenue, and had Brussels carpets and lace curtains to her heart's content. She was stopping at her brother's house for a few days previous to her summer trip to the White Mountains, and the very force of contrast between her elegant, easy life and Mrs. Porter's quiet, industrious one, made that lady look with hard eyes on her own laborious lot. She felt very much disgusted with herself for coming to the beach that morning. What was the beach to her? Or why should she who had so much to do waste a whole day staring at the ocean? Of course, it would have been a disappointment to the children. But what of that? She said gloomily. The children must learn to bear disappointment as their mother has before them. They will probably have little else to look forward to. I never have. Now, please do Mrs. Porter justice. She didn't mean one word of this. Her life had been a quiet but a very happy one, and she knew it, and she would have sat up and worked all night rather than to have her children lose that day at the beach. But it was so nice once in a while, when one feels in the mood, to be thoroughly and hopelessly miserable. At this point, Dick came plunging through the sand, baby Nell in her arms, and called Mrs. Porter's name. The lady turned impatiently. "That girl is the plague of my life," she muttered. "Forever screaming after me and wanting something. What I keep her for is more than any mortal can tell." Then she spoke aloud and sharply. "Put the baby down. What do you carry her in that absurd fashion for? Let her sit in the sand. What do you want?" "If you please, ma'am, the little bit of a gold pin that fastens baby Nell's blanket is gone. We were walking along, and the wind just took us and blew us right around, and blew off baby's hat, and when I got it, and got her straightened up again, the pin was gone." Mrs. Porter's answer was prompt and decided. "Well, then, you may go and find it, and don't come back until you have done so. I can't afford to buy gold pins for you to lose." "What shall I do with baby Nell, ma'am?" questioned patient Dick. "Leave her where she is. You don't give her a chance to play in the sand at all. You just drag her around in your arms. Now go, and mind you don't come back without that pin." I don't think Mrs. Porter realized her own absurdity. The little gold slide wasn't an inch long, and not much wider than a thread. And, of course, the idea of finding it in that sea sand was absurd. But when people are in ill humor, they seldom realize their own folly. Away went Dick to her hopeless task, and Mrs. Porter turned back to the sea, merely glancing first to see if baby Nell was in a dry place. Then she walked on a few steps, looking gloomily out into the surging waters, and continuing her gloomy thoughts. Baby Nell was in a high state of glee. She was not afraid, no, indeed. Why should she be? Nothing ever hurt her. She fancied that everybody and everything loved her. She tossed the warm sand in her chubby little fists, and showered it over her feet, white feet, from which she hurriedly jerked her slippers and stockings. This fun lasted for some time, and nobody saw that the treacherous sea was creeping nearer and nearer to baby Nell. Nobody but baby herself. She saw it and liked it, and helped it along as fast as she could. She went, with swift little creeps, out into the wet and slippery sand, only glancing back now and then. And as no warning voice said the familiar, "No, no, baby mustn't," she went gaily on. The water came surging about her feet, and she only yelled with glee. She thought the sea was only a great, splendid bathtub. She crept a little nearer. There came a great, white wave, dashing and splurging, and broke right around her, splattering the water all over her curly head, and giving her a taste of its saltness. She shivered a little at this, and looked around, and said her one little word in a wandering, pitiful tone, "Mamma." but Mamma was looking away out to sea and thinking sullenly about her carpets and curtains. And so there came another great swelling wave, and broke away above her head, and took baby Nell's strength and breath quite away. And when it slipped wickedly back again into the sea, it carried the baby with it. She gave a weak little cry, but the great sea roared, and nobody heard the cry. Nobody knows what prompted the mother just then to turn from her carpets and look for her darling, and above the roar of ocean, the people on the beach heard the awful shriek, long, loud, and piercing, that came from the mother's heart. It all happened in a very few seconds. The shrieks of the mother as she tried to plunge through the sand, terrified ladies following helplessly after her, and away ahead of them all, a little, swift-moving shadow dashing headlong down the beach and out into the very sea itself. Just a second more, and Dick had snatched the little white dripping bundle that a great wave was just ready to devour, and, battling fiercely with the wave that broke in fury over her head, she made her way, panting and breathless, and laid the pale-faced, tired baby in her mother's arms, ere she sank down utterly exhausted in the sand. What a time they had after that! With what eager, nervous haste they worked over that baby! How quickly the dripping clothes were torn off, and the little body rubbed until it glowed all over. Then she was wrapped in blankets and shawls, and pinned securely, like a little mummy. Then the whole party wedged themselves into the carriage, and drove rapidly homeward. They had had enough of the beach and the sea. Dick, very wet and very happy, was rolled in a great blanket shawl, and lay curled snugly inside the carriage with her head on Mrs. Willard's lap. Will ever anything look pleasanter to Mrs. Porter than did her own dainty parlor that evening, with the curtains drawn, and the gas light brightening the carpet, and the whole circle all complete? Baby Nell, in a fresh, white suit, danced and fluttered and jabbered as joyously as though the ocean had not almost swallowed her that day, and the thankful mother held her securely, and looked down upon her with soft, happy eyes. Could it be possible that it was she who had cared for carpets and curtains that morning? How rich and cheerful looking her curtains were after all, and the carpet so much brighter than she had any idea of. She would not have new ones for anything. She shivered at the bare thought. But for thoughts of them, she would not have left baby Nell that morning among those cruel waves. "She is just the age that my baby was when I lost her. Did you think of it, Alice?" Mrs. Willard asked, gazing tenderly on baby Nell. And the mother, too much moved to answer with words, snugged her darling closer and shed grateful tears over her happier lot. "If you please, ma'am," Dick said, appearing at the door, "here is the little gold pin. I found it, and I was coming with it when I saw baby Nell." "Oh, dear child," said Mrs. Porter tremulously, "I wish you had thrown it in the ocean. I never want to see it again. If I had not sent you to find it—" Then she stopped, with quivering lip and choking voice. Just then baby Nell gave one of her sudden springs and landed safely in Dick's outstretched arms, and as they watched her cooing and nestling there, Elsie slid toward her mother and said softly, "Mamma, if we hadn't squeezed this morning and made room for Dick, what would have become of baby?" End of section 10. Section 11 of Dr. Deane's Way and Other Stories by Fay Huntington and Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. How It Happened, Chapter 7. I am an old woman, nigh on to 80 years. Leastways, I'm past 70, and 80 don't seem very far off. I belong to this Porter family, of which you've heard tell so much. John Porter, he's my oldest son, and the only one I've got now. And Sarah Willard, she's my only daughter. I belong to the long list of very much troubled and pulled about old mothers that we read and hear so much about. Only I'm on t'other side of the line. Part of the time I live with my daughter, Sarah Willard, on Pennsylvania Avenue, and part of the time I live down here in Stone Street with my son, John Porter. And there ain't a nook nor a corner of the grand house on the avenue, with all its handsome furniture, marble and velvet and damask and what not, nor of this cozy little house here in Stone Street, that every single soul on 'em don't think looks a little nicer and comfortable if grandma is in it. Whichever house I'm in when I begin to gather up my traps and pack my trunk, and talk about going to the other place for a spell, there's the greatest hue and cry you ever heard tell of. The children, they hang around me as if there wa'n't anybody in this world but grandma, and my grown-up children ain't a bit behind them. So, between both families, I'm kept in a kind of muddle, most of the time a-trying to decide which of them needs me most. I'm one of the old-fashioned kind. I wear plain white caps with close borders, and I wear very plain, short-waisted black dresses, but my daughter Sarah, she tends to the gettin' of 'em up, and they are nice and fine and soft, I can tell you. You ought to see my grand easy-chair that was bought a purpose for me. It sits in the nicest corner of the back parlor in Sarah's house, and when I am seated in it of a morning, Sarah, she brings her grand visitors out, and she says to 'em, 'This is my mother,' as chirk and proud as if I was a queen instead of a wrinkled-up old woman. As for son-in-law Willard, I don't know as he ever came up to the house in his life that he didn't bring mother some oranges, or some figs, or some grapes, or some new-fashioned candy, or something or other. But land sakes, I don't know as the chair is a bit easier than this old-fashioned, high-backed one that I'm sitting in this minute, and that daughter-in-law Porter stuffed and covered, back and sides and arms, a purpose for me. And baby Nell, she sits in my lap and coos, and smooths out the wrinkles on my old face with her dear, teeny little hand, and kisses me with her tongue, and snuggles her curly head in my neck, and goes to sleep as good as a kitten, times when the rest of 'em can't do nothing with her. As for my son John, I do really believe he thinks that there ain't but one mother in this blessed earth, and that's his mother. But I begun this a purpose to tell you a little story about my son John and my grandson Fred. This morning we had a terrible time. I never did see a house turned more topsy-turvy than this was for a little while. John, he flew about like a north wind. I knew by the signs, before I heard a word, that he was a-hunting something. He always was a-losing things and a-hunting of 'em when he was a boy. Well, how he did whiz around, to be sure. Pretty soon I heard his voice. "Where's my bank book?" says he. "I laid it right here on this table. Someone's taken it. Here, Elsie, have you been meddling with my bank book?" Elsie, she said she didn't know nothing about it, and then he said, "That's a likely story. Bank books didn't walk unless somebody walked 'em." Daughter-in-law Porter, she was very meek and quiet-like, but she looked under the table and inside the coffee pot, just as people do when they're kind of flustered, and don't quite know what they're about. And she said, "It's very strange." Then John spoke up real sharp and testy, and says he, "It ain't strange at all. I never laid a thing down in this house and found it again, never. The children are as mischievous and meddlesome as the day is long, and you'd let the baby have the glass pitcher and the hammer if she wanted them." And he glared at the children as if they belonged to some old vagrant and not to him at all. I declare for it, I guess we all felt relieved and rested like when he finally got his hat on and flew out of the house. Daughter-in-law, she didn't say a word. She just gave the children a peach all around, and by she says to me,
John is hurried almost to death about his business. He does have too much to do sometimes. He is in such a hurry that he doesn't know what he says or does." We had a quiet enough day after that. John was so busy that he couldn't come home to dinner, so we had it all by ourselves, and baby Nell was the only real busy one in the house that day. I declare for it if she didn't make every bone in my body ache the way she trotted around. When I took her in my lap to try to quiet her, she pulled my specs from my nose and put them on herself, and pulled down my white hair to make it curl like mamma's. When my own babies used to do mischief, I always used to consider it my duty to slap their fingers. But, dear me, I always thought it hurt me more than it did them, enough sight. And I'm glad them days are gone by, and it's no concern of mine to be slapping baby Nell's soft little fingers.
End of section 11. Section 12 of Dr. Deane's Way and Other Stories by Faye Huntington and Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. How It Happened, Chapter 8. Baby got her work all done after a spell, and toddled over to me, willing to be taken up and patted and sung to sleep. And there she lay in my arms sleeping quiet as a lamb when her father came home to tea. He had got quiet too. He brought an orange for me and a fig for the baby, and he kissed her and talked to me good-naturedly a spell, and then sat down to read his evening paper. Fred was in the hall with his slate and pencil. He had been there quite a while, working away, and once he brought his slate to show me. He was making a picture of a steam engine that he had been to see that day, and it was just the completest thing, screws and wheels all fixed. He explained to me as natural as if he had built the whole thing himself. I believe that boy is going to be a genius. It seemed as if everybody in the last half hour had wanted something of Fred. His mother called him, and the cook she wanted him, and then Elsie had to have something she couldn't reach, and so he was laying down his slate and pencil and bobbing up and down most of the time. The next thing that happened, his pencil was lost. He hunted after it quite patient for a spell, and then he begun to fret. "Now, what has become of that pencil?" I heard him say. "I never did see the beat. A fellow can't make anything in this house. Where could it have got to? Elsie Porter, I just believe you have been meddling with it. I just wish you would let my things alone." And then there was a good deal of sputtering between him and Elsie, she saying, "I didn't," and he saying, "You did." Just then my son John jumped up and went out there pretty spry, and says he, "Fred, what do you mean by such kind of talk as that? Working up such an uproar about a slate pencil, and being so cross to your sister. I won't have such goings on. You can go to your room and stay there until after supper. We don't want such a cross boy to take supper with us." Then he came back and sat down to his paper again. I sat and thought quite a spell, and then says I, "John, did you find your bank book?" He looked at me kind of foolish like, and says he, "Yes, I did. I found it in my other coat pocket. I had forgotten that I had changed my coat." "Well then," says I, very grave and solemn like, "you can just go into that clothes press and get on the shelf, and you can't have no supper, because we don't want no cross boys to our supper." John, he looked at me a minute, and then he burst out laughing, and laughed so loud I was afraid he'd wake baby Nell. Pretty soon says he, "Seems to me that's pretty hard on me, ain't it, mother? A bank book is of more consequence than a slate pencil." "John," says I, "that depends on how you look at them. You can be sure of one thing,
Things look amazing different at 50 from what they did at 10, and I make no manner of doubt that when you was 10 or 12, a slate pencil was enough more important according to your notion than a bank book, specially if you had happened to be making a steam engine. Then I up and told him all about the steam engine, how cute and perfect it was. He listened as pleased as could be, and says he, "Yes, he's a smart little fellow, no mistake about that. I don't know but I was pretty sharp with him. I'll call him presently and let him come down to tea." Then he read his paper for a spell, and I sot and thought. There's things that I've been wanting to say to him this long time, but I didn't know just how to set about it. Finally, I thought I'd say them just as it happened out of my heart, without any fixing. "John," says I've been thinking today about going home. I've been down here a great many years, and it stands to reason that I can't stay here very much longer. I'm expecting the Lord will send for me most any day, and I'm willing and ready to go. Only for one thing. How am I going to be certain that I'll see you again after a while? John, you've been doing about everything you could think of for your mother all your life. Won't you do just one thing more? Let me be sure I can have you with me always." I broke down there. My voice got all trembly like. You see, I felt it so much, this one trouble of mine. John, he looked kind of startled at first, and then his face got pale and tears came into his eyes. He came and leaned over my chair and kissed me twice, and says he, his voice all shaky, "Mother, I'll try, but don't you talk about going away and leaving us. I can't bear it." Then he went out of the room. I sat thinking about it a little spell, and the more I thought, the more I felt as if I must have it, till at last I went and laid baby Nell on the bed in my room, and I got down on my knees by her to ask the Lord if there was any more that I could do. And after I had prayed a little, it seemed to me as if I heard a voice saying, "Those lambs, grandmother, coax those lambs into the right way, and like enough the sheep will follow."
End of section 12. Section 13 of Dr. Deane's Way and Other Stories by Faye Huntington and Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. How It Happened, Chapter 9. "Have you a handkerchief, Elsie?" Mrs. Porter asked this just as Elsie and her father were ready to start. Everybody in the house had been helping. Mrs. Porter had been up since sunrise, and it was an August day, so she rose pretty early. And Grandma came in without her cap in her haste to help them off. Baby Nell had helped too. She put the key to the valise in the water pitcher and gave one of Elsie's shoes to the dog under the window. But in spite of all delays and mishaps, they were finally ready. "Yes'm," Elsie said in answer to her mother's question. "I have that hem-stitched one that Aunt Sarah sent me." "It has no name on," Mrs. Porter said hesitatingly. "I am afraid you'll lose it. Well, never mind. There is no time to change it now." "It has a name, Mother. It is marked 'Saw' in the corner." "Marked 'Saw'? What do you mean, child?" "Why, don't you know? S.A.W. are Aunt Sarah Willard's initials, and they are worked in the corner. Dick calls it my 'saw handkerchief.'" And Elsie went away laughing. I want you to know that she was going to New York. Mr. Porter ran down to the city on business every 2 or 3 months, sometimes oftener, but although it wasn't much more than 2 or 3 hours' ride from home, Elsie Porter had never been there, and she had longed with all her might to go. At last she had her wish. Fred went to the depot to see them off, and said, half enviously, that he was the oldest, he ought to have gone first. "Ladies served first, always. That is a gentleman's creed," Mr. Porter said, as he gave into his hands the change left from buying tickets. "I know it. All right, thank you, father," said Fred, choking down his envy and smiling at the 63 cents in his hands. Then the whistle blew, and people crowded and pushed each other, and all tried to get on or off the cars at once, but found that after all they had time enough to take it more quietly. Elsie put her shawl strap containing her crimson and black plaid shawl in the rack above her head, shook out her linen polonaise, stuffed her hem-stitched handkerchief into the conspicuous side pocket, surveyed the buttons of her kid boots to see that they were in immaculate order, then looked complacently around the car. She was certainly a very well-dressed young girl, comparing favorably with any about her, and she was on her way to New York. "Meet the 7:50 train tonight, Fred," she called out amid the shrieks of the engine. She had studied the timetable, and the business-like sentence, "the 7:50 train," rolled glibly from her tongue. "Well," said Mr. Porter, "you are fairly started for New York at last, aren't you? Does it feel as nice as you thought it would?" Then he bought her 2 apples, an orange, a pint of peanuts, and a box of prize candy. After that he read the newspaper. Elsie Porter was not by nature a timid little girl. Thus far she had found very few things in her life worth being afraid of, and she was perfectly astonished at the nervous way in which she clutched at her father's arm, and held on tight, as he pushed and elbowed his way among the throng at the depot. What a tangle of men, women, trunks, and children there were! More than half of the time Elsie suspected that her father was hunting for something that he couldn't find and didn't know what he was about, for no sooner was she seated in a street car, looking at the people, than he whisked her out of it into an omnibus, then back into a street car again, and it seemed to her bewildered vision that they were going over precisely the same ground that they had just traversed. Suddenly he stopped on the sidewalk, rushed into a large house, through a hall, up a flight of stairs, pulling breathless Elsie after him, and landed her in a large, handsome room. "Now, Elsie," he said, "I must leave you here a little while. I have some business to attend to near here, and you can rest until I come back. Then I will take you somewhere." "Father," said Elsie, very much startled, "I don't like to stay here alone. I wish you would let me go with you. I wouldn't trouble you at all." "You couldn't, child. I've got to go where there is a great crowd. It is as much as I can do to get myself through. Why, you're not afraid, are you?" Elsie shook her head resolutely. The idea of having Fred and Dick told that she was afraid, and Dick had lived in New York a whole year. "Why, no," she said hesitatingly. "I'm not afraid, of course. But then it's kind of strange and lonesome, you know. Whose house is this, anyway, and where are the people? Aren't they friends of yours?" "Whose house? Why, it's French's hotel. You don't think I pitch into private houses this way, I hope? This is the public parlor, and there's plenty going on down the street to look at, and I thought you would like it." "French's hotel?" repeated Elsie in great surprise. "Why, I thought hotels stood away from other buildings and had long piazzas and ever so many doors." Her father laughed. "You are thinking of the hotels at home, I guess," he said. "They don't have any room for piazzas and extra doors in this part of the city. Well, what am I going to do with you? If you are afraid to stay here alone, why, that's another thing." But meantime, all Elsie's native courage had returned to her. It was certainly splendid to be left alone in the public parlor of a grand hotel, just as if she were a lady. "I'm not in the least afraid," she said with energy. "What should I be afraid of?" "Sure enough," said the father. I don't see anything. Well, now, you understand that you are to stay right here until I come back. I won't be long, and of course you won't venture out into the street alone."
"Of course not," Elsie said, and seated herself complacently in a chair by the window while her father hurried away. "What crowds and crowds of people!" she said, flattening her nose against the glass. "I do wonder where they can all be going, and what makes them in such a hurry. So many horses, too! I wouldn't be down among them for anything. Oh my, what splendid peaches! I wonder what Fred would say to them. He thought that one he gave me last night was big. I do wish I had one of those for him. They're twice as large as any I ever saw. If I was down there, I might buy some. I've got some money, and I don't s'pose that father meant I wasn't to go just down there in front of the door. I could buy one for mother, too. How fast they are selling them!"
End of section 13. Section 14 of Dr. Deane's Way and Other Stories by Fay Huntington and Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. How It Happened, Chapter 10. As for Mr. Porter, he went with all speed down the stairs, and was promptly lost to Elsie's sight among a crowd of men. He was at all times a quick-motioned man, but he hurried through with more business in 1 hour that morning than he often did in 2. There was a new feeling about this coming to New York. For the first time in his life, a little daughter was waiting for him just around the corner. "Let me see," he said, looking at his watch. "I've been gone an hour. Elsie will be getting tired. Well, I've done a good deal of work. I shouldn't wonder if I could push into Central Park now. I've got to go pretty well up in that direction, and Elsie would like that about as well as anything. I wish I had time to go over to Brooklyn. Fred wanted her to be sure and tell him about the ferry boats, but I guess that must go until he comes. I'll bring him down next time. Here we are. I'll just take Elsie up to Stewart's with me. She wanted to see the big store." And the eager father sprung up the steps of French's Hotel 3 at a time. A well-pleased father he was. He had succeeded in planning, so that quite a little time could be devoted to sightseeing with his daughter. Up to the public parlor and down its length he strode. The room had filled up during his absence. There were children of all sizes, but he saw nothing of Elsie. He shaded his street-blinded eyes with his hand, and walked slowly back again, looking steadfastly at every little girl. She certainly was not there. A little startled, he stepped out into the hall and ran against a waiter. "Do you know where my little girl is?" The waiter, not being used to such curious questions, answered him with a stare, and finally said, "Who is your little girl?" Sure enough, how should he go to work to tell? He hesitated, looked bewildered, but finally said, "She is about as tall as that girl by the end window, and has brown hair. She had on a brown linen dress, and—" The waiter interrupted him. "I beg pardon, sir, but the house is full of little girls of that size from morning till night, and they all wear brown linen dresses, or something like that, but they are generally in care of someone. Who did you leave your little girl with?" "Why," said Mr. Porter, speaking fast and nervously, "I never thought of leaving her with anyone. She was to stay right here by that window until I came back." "She is probably taking a walk through the halls. They mostly do that," he added, beginning to pity the anxious father. Then what a search there was! Mr. Porter grew excited and frightened every minute, and flew up and down stairs like a wild man. The proprietor of the hotel was found and questioned, but he knew no more about Elsie Porter than he did about the man in the moon. "Did you book your name, sir?" he asked of Mr. Porter. "Why, no," said that gentleman eagerly. "I only left her for an hour, you know. Then I was coming to get her. We are going back home to-night." Did you leave her in charge of anybody, chambermaid or anyone? Poor Mr. Porter shook his head. He began to feel as if he had willfully thrown her away. Finally, the servants' bell was rung, and all the people employed in the hotel trooped together to the office, and were questioned. One of them, "See a little girl about that size and dressed in linen, buff linen, with brown trimmings?" Mr. Porter nodded eagerly. "Well, I see her eating some peanuts, and the next time I went by the door, I see she wasn't there." And this was all. Mr. Porter's awakened hopes went down to zero. They were very full of sympathy, these servant girls. They searched promptly and willingly through every room, every hall, every stairway, every closet from the attic to the basement in the rear. No Elsie. Can you guess how nearly distracted Mr. Porter was by this time? Can you imagine what an afternoon he had? He ate no dinner. He meant to have had such a grand dinner, he and Elsie, at a hotel table, when she was to order whatever she chose to fancy. He did not go near Central Park or Stewart's store. Instead, he hovered around French's hotel, questioning the boarders, loungers in the bar room, the policemen who stalked by on their rounds. All to no purpose. If the earth had opened and swallowed Elsie up, she couldn't have disappeared more suddenly and hopelessly. One policeman saw a little girl answering to the description, trying to cross the street, and he called to her that she would better not, but there was a fracas at the corner just then, and he had turned to that. "And what became of the little girl?" Mr. Porter said, waiting breathlessly. The policeman smiled. "That is more than I know. She crossed, I presume, without any accident. They mostly do." "There was an accident about here, though, this morning. A child run over," a bystander said. "A girl?" asked Mr. Porter, quickly. "No, a boy, I think. I wasn't here. I heard somebody speak of it." "Yes," the policeman said. "It was a boy, I believe, and 2 girls yesterday. It is a dangerous corner." Mr. Porter's face grew paler, and he turned sick at heart. "I thought you said they generally crossed safely," he said fiercely. The policeman smiled again. "Well, 1,000 or 2 of them did, but 2 got hurt." And that was all. To him, Elsie Porter was only one of 1,000 or 2 of girls. To her father, it was as if there were no other girl. It was a half hour after the evening train had left the depot that he bethought himself of the people at home, who would be expecting them on that train. Now, what could he say to them? Of course he couldn't go home. What! Go home without Elsie? He could never do that. He might telegraph. Detained until morning train. He would surely find her by that time, and this dispatch he finally sent, leaving them to bear the disappointment as best they could. "If they only knew what detains me," he muttered, as his trembling hand wrote the message, and a great lump seemed to rise up in the strong man's throat. Night was setting down upon him, and where should he go to find Elsie? And how could he live until morning if he did not find her? End of section 14. Section 15 of Dr. Deane's Way and Other Stories by Fay Huntington and Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. How It Happened, Chapter 11. Fred Porter stalked home from the depot in a very much disgusted frame of mind. He had been to meet the 10:50 train, the morning after his father's departure from home. "They didn't come, mother," he called out, as soon as he came within sight of her, waiting at the window. "There's another dispatch instead. I suppose they are detained until night now. A nice time Els is having." By this time he had reached his mother's side, and stood looking over her shoulder while she broke the seal and read, "Take first train for New York. Bring baby and Dick." Mr. Porter had studied over that dispatch. Such a night as he had spent he never would forget, up and out all night, hunting aimlessly through the streets, talking with policemen, visiting station houses, and morning found him without a single trace of Elsie. Now the family at home must have some word. He could not telegraph that Elsie was lost. He could never write it to them. Besides, her mother, she could find her. Elsie was a great mother child, always. The mother would surely contrive some plan by which to get their darling again. The mother must come. But she couldn't leave baby? No, baby Nell must come too. But what could they do with baby Nell while they planned and hunted for Elsie? Dick must come. Baby Nell would stay with her day or night. So the telegram went. So it reached the family at home. Fred Porter read it over twice, with fast blurring eyes. Take first train for New York. Bring baby and Dick. And not me! Mother! Fred's voice shook. Elsie must be sick, the little mother said, with a quietness of tone that she did not feel. Father knows that his boy will be wanted at home to help us off, and take care of things at home until we come. When is the first train, my son? It is at 12 o'clock, and it's after 11 now. Shall I get Uncle Hall to drive down with you, Mother? Fred's voice had cleared and was strong and helpful. There was that in his mother's tone and words that had made a man of him. Mr. Porter was waiting for the 2 o'clock train, and he clutched at baby Nell with a nervousness that startled Mrs. Porter afresh. How is Elsie? She said, the instant her voice could reach his ear. Here is a carriage, he said in answer. Get in, Dick, quick. Now drive to French's hotel. John, said Mrs. Porter, and she laid her hand on his arm. Tell me just exactly how Elsie is. I don't know how she is, he said with tremulous lips. If I could tell you that she was very sick and I was taking care of her, I should be thankful. Alice, she is lost. I haven't seen one glimpse of her since 10 o'clock yesterday morning, and I can't get the least clue to her whereabouts. I am glad I cannot describe to you what the Porter family said and did and endured during the next 3 weeks. The places they visited, the people they questioned, the times when they thought they had found her, and the awful disappointment when they discovered their mistake. It makes me sick to think of it, and nobody can describe such suffering. If she had only died, with us taking care of her! Would Mrs. Porter cry out, night after night, with something between a moan and a groan. And when mothers come to places where they can say that, why, there is nothing left that words can tell. But she rose up the next morning and went about the search again. Long before this, Fred had been told the dreadful story, and daily letters went home to him, where he bravely waited, bearing his hard, hard part, that of doing the errands for his uncle, and going to school as usual, and going to the store to see what message Stephen Turner had to send to father, and doing all those commonplace little things, instead of having the dismal comfort of helping in that dreadful search. So the days wore on, and every morning they said with a touch of hopefulness, "We shall surely find some clue today," and every evening they said with white lips, "Another night without her." Ever so many people had come to know the small, pale lady who went about with such a quiet, sorrowful face, looking right and left about her, and staring at every child she met, and the restless, nervous man, with haggard face and wild eyes, who gave himself time neither to eat nor sleep, in his vain search after the lost daughter. The papers were full of the sad story, the police were earnestly at work, and still no trace of Elsie. Dick's business during these weary days was to keep eyes and hands on baby Nell, who grew more lawless and full of mischief every hour. There was just 1 hour of respite for her. That was during baby Nell's afternoon nap. Regularly at that hour came Mrs. Porter from her search, and bolting the door against all interruption, knelt beside her sleeping daughter to pour out her heart's longing for the daughter who was not with her. Jesus knew where she was, and to Jesus this helpless mother was driven, as she had never been before. This hour Dick devoted to searching for Elsie. Her method of search was very peculiar. First, though she took the best possible means for succeeding, she always got down behind the great rocker in the corner, and said with great earnestness these words: "Lord Jesus, help me to find Elsie Porter." Every day, just these words, nothing more, never less. Dick had but lately learned anything about prayer, but she had what many a praying Christian might have envied, a very firm belief that her prayer was to be answered, of course. Wasn't she speaking to Jesus Christ, and didn't he always hear? From her knees she went directly down the walk in front of the hotel, and steadily pursued her plan of work, which was to speak to every single person who passed that way, saying always this one thing: "Elsie Porter is lost. Do you know anything about her?" Some of the people passed by her with an astonished stare, some of them didn't hear her at all, but many stopped and inquired. There was a good deal of method in Dick's plan of work. This was the way she reasoned about it. "If the people who pass by don't know anything about her, maybe they'll come across her this very day, and if I tell them about her, they will know where to bring her. Besides, a great many people must have passed by that day she got lost, and if I keep watch and ask them all, maybe someone will go by who saw something happen to her, and can tell me about her." It was fortunate for Dick's plan that the hour in the day that she was at liberty was the hour when there was the least passing by. As it was, there were many who escaped her question. These she sighed over, but regularly found comfort in the thought, "I asked the Lord Jesus Christ to help me, and it's likely he knows whether those folks know anything about her." There was one other thought that comforted Dick. She knew what occupied Mrs. Porter at this hour. "She's a-praying about it this minute," she said over and over to herself, and her faith was strengthened. End of section 15. Section 16 of Dr. Deane's Way and Other Stories by Faye Huntington and Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. How It Happened, Chapter 12. It was 3 weeks from the day that Elsie Porter seemed to vanish from the face of the earth. Dick, fresh from her stronghold behind the rocking chair, had stationed herself on the walk below for her hour of work. There was a very ragged, very grimy-looking boy just at the corner. He had taken up his stand there, within a week, to waylay the passers-by and beseech them to buy an evening paper. Dick had surveyed him with much disgust. He reminded her forcibly of the days before she found her chance and began to be respectable. On this particular day she felt like having no possible loophole for information untried, so she resolutely marched up to him, and they had this conversation. "I s'pose you don't know anything about Elsie Porter?" "What makes you s'pose so?" "Well, do you?" "Can't say as I do." "I knew that you didn't." "What made you ask me then?" A gesture of disgust from Dick, a chuckle from the boy. Meantime, people were passing. Dick darted towards a group and began her work. The boy grew interested. "Who is she?" he asked in one of the pauses. "She is our little girl, and she has been lost for 3 weeks." "Where was she? Tell us about her." Long practice had made Dick prompt and brief in telling this story. She answered with a hopeless sigh. "She came to New York with her father. He left her here at French's Hotel and was away only an hour. When he came back, she was gone, and that is all we know about her." The ragged boy whistled. "That's a pretty tough thing now, ain't it?" he said sympathizingly. I wish I did know something about her. 3 weeks ago, did you say?
Just exactly 3 weeks this very day. The 2nd day of August it was,
Dick said mournfully, and between his questions and her answers she plied her trade of questioning the passers-by. The 2nd day of August. That's the day. Text missing. Was off his beat. I was down here in these parts that day, and there was a girl got killed. Maybe your girl was saw. Who knows? There was a group of people coming, but Dick paid no attention to them. She turned with eager eyes to the boy and grasped his arm.
Who is Saw? What do you mean? What do you know about her?
Oh, she wasn't your girl, the boy said coolly. Things don't generally happen that way, and I don't know who she was from Adam. She was rushing after a peach cart to buy peaches, and she dropped her handkercher, and I picked it up and was going after her, but some horses knocked her down, and they took her into that 'ere house over there. That's a hospital. And she died, and I carried her handkercher over to her, and it was marked Saw in one corner. Dick clasped her hands together with a moan of pain.
It's our Elsie,
she said in a low, solemn voice.
Are you sure she is dead?
Yes, I'm sure, 'cause I carried the handkercher over that very afternoon, and I asked how the girl was that was took in, and they said dead.
I'm going over there, said Dick with quiet determination. There may be some mistake. There's mistakes to most things. Did they take the handkerchief?
Yes, they did. But you can get it again if you prove property. They keep all such things for proof, you know. I'll go along with you and whet their memories. Threading her way across the street to the great building, Dick, by dint of being guided by her new acquaintance, and after answering endless questions, got some information. There was a girl brought in here. She was unconscious and was supposed dead, but she rallied. Then we discovered that she was Mrs. Wheeler's daughter on 4th Avenue, and she was moved there.
Is she the one the handkerchief belonged to?
Dick questioned eagerly. Yes, the woman said, and the handkerchief went with the rest of the things in the carriage.
Was it marked?
Yes, it was marked SAW in one corner. That was why I remembered this boy, because he said the handkerchief belonged to that girl named Saw that was hurt. That was the way they came to know where to send her. They had heard that Mrs. Judge Wheeler's daughter was missing, and someone in the house happened to know that her name was Stella Ames Wheeler.
Did she die?
Was Dick's next eager question. That the woman had never heard. She should think more than likely she did. She was hurt about her head. Still, Dick was full of questions.
Could the woman remember how she was dressed?
Why, yes, I almost always remember to describe dresses. It is a part of my business to remember. She wore a buff linen suit with brown trimmings and kid boots buttoned up, and she had a pretty big ring on her 3rd finger with a stone in it. Dick interrupted suddenly.
Please, can you tell me just exactly where that lady lives? Now I'm going to take a carriage and go to her house, she said emphatically to her ragged boy as she left the hospital. That woman described our Elsie exactly, ring and all.
It was a short ride, and Dick, half wild with excitement, found herself standing in Mrs. Judge Wheeler's hall before she had any idea what she wanted to say to that lady. She talked fast and without much connection when Mrs. Wheeler came to her.
Oh, if you please, ma'am, was your little girl's handkerchief marked SAW? And did she wear a buff linen suit the day she was brought home? And did she die?
Mrs. Wheeler was a small, pale woman dressed in deep mourning.
Are you looking for someone you have lost?
She said, and her voice was so low and gentle that Dick's excitement calmed down of itself, and she said simply,
Yes, ma'am.
My little girl was killed at a fire, Mrs. Wheeler said tremulously.
And the next day there was sent to me from the hospital a little girl whom they supposed to be mine. She was so very sick that I couldn't send her away, and I have taken care of her ever since. She has had brain fever and has been very, very sick, and is not yet so that she knows where she is, or can tell who she is. She has talked a great deal in her delirium about baby Nell, and sometimes mentioned Dick and Fred. Do you know any such little girl?" "It is our Elsie," said Dick, and then she sat down on the hall carpet and cried so hard and so loud that she frightened everybody in the house. Tea was just ready at Mr. Porter's. Mrs. Porter set a huge dish of peaches on the table as the crowning touch. Fred, with baby Nell in his arms, stood at the window, watching father as he came up the walk. Dick passed back and forth, setting chairs, bringing water, and answering baby Nell's chuckle of delight. In a great armchair, pillows at her back, a footstool under her feet, sat Elsie. Her hair was coming out in new soft, little rings all over her head. Her eyes looked twice as large as they used to, and there were heavy rings of black under them. But there was a pleased smile on her pale face, for this was the first day that she had been able to sit up until tea time. She was getting well. Gathered about the tea table, they talked over the whole story, for the 100th time, just as people are possessed to do. "I can't understand what that Mrs. Wheeler could have been about, that she didn't read the papers and find out you were lost." Fred had made very much the same remark 20 times before, and didn't seem to get much satisfaction. "She had enough to be about," said Elsie. "I was awful sick, you know, and her own little girl was dead." "But she advertised you in the papers. Why didn't she look in and see if anybody answered?" "She said she never thought of it," Dick said. "Elsie was brought from the hospital, you know, and she said she thought she was some child without near relations. But she advertised her for fear people were looking, but she never thought to look at the advertisements of other folks. I don't think that was strange. You see, she thought people would come and call on her if they wanted to know more about it." "And she hadn't much time to read the paper," Elsie chimed in. "It was no stranger than we did, anyway," Mr. Porter said. "We all acted like a company of idiots. Why didn't we read the paper and find her advertisement? I never once thought of anybody else advertising. I thought we were doing it all." "What puzzled me is that those people at the hospital didn't know more about her. They certainly must have found out when they took her there that she was not Mrs. Wheeler's little girl." This was Mrs. Porter's addition to the family puzzle. Dick shook her head positively. "No, she said. They told me about that, too. The little girl, Mrs. Wheeler's little girl, you know, wasn't buried yet, and the house was full of people coming and going, and the girl who came to the door thought that it was a girl who was so sick they couldn't carry her any farther, and of course they wouldn't turn her away. Then afterwards, Mrs. Wheeler went to the hospital and saw one of the doctors, but she said she supposed the nurses were not told about it." "Oh, it's easy to understand, after all," Mr. Porter said. "If you remember that it was in New York that it happened, 1/3 of the people might be killed without the other 2/3 knowing much about it. There's such a swarm of people, and so many accidents, and so many children that don't seem to belong to anybody. The wonder is that we ever found any trace of her again." "Why, you'd have found me when I began to know anything about myself," Elsie said. "But then," she added, with a little tremble of the lips, "I guess maybe I would never have known anything about myself or anybody if mother had not come just when she did." "That was what the doctor said, daughter," Mr. Porter said tenderly. "You needed something to arouse you. So you owe your life to your mother, after all." "Under God."
Mrs. Porter said softly, and then they were quiet a few minutes, until Fred burst forth with, "I say, Dick, why didn't you speak to that fellow before?" Dick laughed a little, and looked confused. "He was such a dirty, ragged boy," she said at last. "I didn't want to speak to him at all. I thought it was foolish to suppose that he knew anything about it." "The wonder is that she thought to speak to him at all, or to any of them," Mr. Porter said. "I'm sure it was a plan that would never have entered my head." "How came you to think of it, anyhow?" Fred asked. "I didn't," said Dick gravely. "I never thought of it at all. The Lord Jesus told it to me himself." Fred whistled a little. He couldn't help it, he was so surprised. The rest were silent. Suddenly Fred spoke again. "Well, I say it was queer anyhow, that ragged newsboy should be the only one of all the crowds of people who knew anything about it." During this talk, Stephen Turner had come in with a message for Mr. Porter, and waited for his answer. He spoke out now, as if it came from his heart. "It was his chance, you may depend." "His chance!" said Mr. Porter. "What do you mean, Stephen?" "His chance to do something good, something to help people, that would help him too. They all have it, I think." "That's an idea," Mr. Porter said, telegraphing a wise look to his wife. "Have you had yours, Stephen?" "Yes, sir," said Stephen, with a quiet smile. "Mine looked small, but it keeps growing bigger." "And will grow bigger yet, if I have anything to do with it," Mr. Porter answered, laughing. "The way you managed things while I was away surprised and pleased me. I shall not forget it."
Dick had her chance too. That was a great big one, I think, and likely to grow bigger in every way," Mrs. Porter said, with a tender touch to her voice. "She has saved both our daughters for us."
"And is our own little girl now forever." Mr. Porter said this in a very grave and solemn tone. As for Dick, or Mary as they were trying to learn to call her, she cried for very joy and thankfulness. "Mother," said Fred, with a sudden and entire change of voice and subject, "are not these peaches splendid? I wish Elsie could have some of them. Do you think a taste would hurt her?" Elsie shivered a little. "I don't want any," she said. "Father, you said you would tell me some day what that peach I went after cost. Won't you tell me now?" "If you really want to know, child, I may as well tell you now, and be done with it. It figures up about $750 counting the printing and the doctor's bills and everything."
"Oh, my!"
said Elsie, with white lips. Her father hastened his sentence. "A pretty dear peach, daughter, but we'll call it cheap, considering all the lessons it taught us. You learned to be very careful to remember just exactly what father says, and your mother and I learned to remember that we had a Father in heaven who had a much greater right to be obeyed. And all of us learned that he leads by strange ways, and that nothing happened without his knowledge. I suppose he even makes our chances for us, Stephen?" End of section 16.